Today's webinar on OBIEE Security Top 10. My name is Phil Ryman. I'm the Director of Business Development at Integrigy, and I'll be the moderator for this e-learning session. Today's speaker is Mike Miller. Mike is the Vice President of Integrigy and is responsible for Integrigy Security Assessment Services. As a 20-year veteran of enterprise applications, he has worked as a technical architect, developer, and corporate security officer. Mike has focused exclusively on the Oracle Business Suite for the last 16 years and has sat on Oracle's customer advisory boards for security and Oracle On Demand. So I'll now take it over to Mike.
Thank you, Phil. Today's topic is OBIEE Security Top 10. What we are going to be doing here today is taking a very brief look at OBIEE and how it works, and then spend the majority of the time going through OBIEE, our current, I'll say, research and thinking, what we have found in our assessments, and our recent, we'll say, findings. We do have some questions that people have asked as they were registering. We will save those to the end. If you think of a question between now and then, please do register that, as Phil is noting in the webinar question feature. We will also be sending a copy of this presentation to everyone who registered. So if you are taking notes, please keep that in mind. Before we go too much further, though, for those of you who are not familiar with Integrigy, and to just help put into context what we're sharing with you here today, we want to just take this one slide to go with you with regard to Integrigy. Integrigy was formed back in 2001, and we have two lines of business, our products and our services. Our services are very much focused in the material which we are sharing with you here today with regard to security assessments. We also spend a good amount of time assisting people with compliance as well as security design, and our products are very much a product of our security services. Now, we have AppSentry and AppDefend. Both of these are purpose-built tools for the Oracle eBusiness Suite, as well as Oracle, and I should note, SQL Server databases. AppSentry is a security auditing platform, and AppDefend is a purpose-built application firewall for the Oracle eBusiness Suite. But enough about Integrigy. This is an educational webinar, and we will, I think, now cut over and just, I have two slides here on OBIEE, again, just to help put into context what we're talking about here today. So OBIEE is a Fusion middleware application. It sits inside of WebLogic, and what I'm doing with this slide here is trying to give you an overview of the architecture of OBIEE in proportion to the impact on security. So you can see here the largest boxes are WebLogic, OBIEE, and the Web Catalog. This architecture slide here is, I should note, is based upon OBIEE 11G, and the if you are in need of further information with regard to how OBIEE works, we do have another presentation up on our website that goes into the mechanics in much more detail. But just in summary here, what we have is a logon event occurring within WebLogic. You can see that on the right, where we have a logon and then the authentication, that authentication occurring either internally or externally. We have then the authorization or some of the initial authorization decisions being made within the Oracle Platform Security Services, which are then handing off to OBIEE. So the flow here would be the user logs on, they're authenticated, and then the first initial authorization decision that is made is can they or can they not use OBIEE. Once that decision is made, the handoff per se is made. OBIEE receives information about the user, most importantly the application roles, their profile, what they're authorized to do, what groups they're members of. With that, variables are set. This is actually occurring transparently. The user really just sees the OBIEE user interface, and the catalog then presents them what they can see and do as far as what reports, KPIs, dashboards, and folders. What I've highlighted here in green are the security features. And we'll touch on this a little bit as we go through the top 10. Please keep this picture in mind because it is a helpful framework to refer back to. We have the security, we have the access control list within the catalog. Within the repository itself, we have the permissions that are set at the presentation layer. The catalog sits basically right on top of the presentation layer. Underneath the presentation layer, we have the business model mappings and the physical tables and columns. So when the user clicks on and runs a report per se, they're actually flowing down into the data sources by going through those levels there. Again, this is a quick 2-slide review of how OBIEE works. If you are in need for a little bit more information, please contact us. We do have some other presentations that go through this in more detail. So, OBIEE Top 10. What we're sharing with you here today is really our latest, as I was saying, our latest research and thinking, as well as findings from our consulting engagements. There are certainly more than 10 issues here, but we're, for the sake of time, limiting to the top 10 here. These risks and findings cover both infrastructure as well as information security as far as the risk. And the order is roughly, we'll say, in the order of risk as well as in the effort or ease to address. So we'll talk briefly about each one of these, and we'll get started with patching. So number one here, if you are not running version 11 of OBIEE, you seriously need to think about upgrading. Oracle is going through I think a build cycle almost every quarter. What I've seen here, one of the later releases I've seen from Oracle is only last in January as far as 11.1.1.1.4, and I think it's almost build like 400. What we are not talking about here are WebLogic patching levels, nor are we talking about the Oracle Business Intelligence, if you are familiar with the financial or HR analytics. We're just talking about the core OBIEE patching. One note here is that OBIEE version 1116 went end of life on 2 April, only a few months ago. So that is now on sustaining support, no longer being patched. So if you're not running on version 1117 or above, you need to be thinking about upgrading. Second, the metadata database. As OBIEE is a Fusion middleware product, it runs inside of WebLogic. WebLogic requires a relational database. That said, next week's webinar, the continuation of this, and there's a link at the back of this presentation to register for that if you haven't done so already, we'll go into the WebLogic Security Top 10. But all WebLogic applications do require a small SQL relational database. It does not need to be Oracle, but most likely, if you're on this call, it is Oracle. Within that repository database, OBIEE has two schemas, the MDS and the BI platform. The recommendation that we have seen based upon our findings is that you do not need to allow access into that. That should be very closed. There's no need for developers to go in there, at least that we have found, with regard to either troubleshoot nor to create content. So that's the first recommendation, is to harden this, make sure that the access is pretty much restricted to potentially a very tight circle of people, akin to how you would control root on an operating system. This database, regardless of whether or not it's Oracle or not, needs to be appropriately secured as far as the security patching. We would also highly recommend, and we'll touch on this later in the presentation with regard to usage tracking, the out-of-the-box auditing or logging for OBIEE that Oracle provides in their examples actually uses the BI platform schema for logging. Our recommendation would be to create a second, a third purpose-built schema for that. So again, the BI platform and the MDS, make sure that those are sufficiently restricted. There's really no need to allow people in there as far as access. Number 3 here, key accounts and the security thereof. Let's go through each one of these in a little bit of detail. Within the operating system itself, there is an account that owns the WebLogic. Couple recommendations here. Do not use WebLogic, quote unquote, or Welcome One. The Welcome One is a default password. WebLogic is readily known. If at all possible, when you go through the install, try to consider a different name to help obfuscate the identity there. The user that runs WebLogic, do not use root or another privileged account. There are some specific notes within Oracle support that guide you through best practices for this as far as starting up and shutting down WebLogic. However you're doing this, again, something that we've seen, you need to be very careful, or certainly thinking about do not hard code the credentials, the passwords in any WebLogic or OBIEE startup or shutdown scripts. Moving on, the WebLogic administrator users. There is within WebLogic a set of users that have full admin privileges. These accounts are used to provision, for example, new versions of OBIEE. You need to be very careful that the correct people are in that list and that you don't have additional people that you don't need or no longer have need for that role. Moving on, there are the BI admin user, the BI system user, and the Oracle system user. The BI system user account is one of the internal accounts. It's basically used for internal authentication to differentiate between different OBIEE components. It should not be used during normal business use. There's no need for your developers to have access to this. It is created by default through the install, and the password is created at random. Likewise, the Oracle system user account is created by default, and the password is also likewise random or created randomly at install. This is another account that's used for internal services. You should not be using these on a day-to-day basis. You need to make sure that whoever does have possession of these passwords, whether or not you're using a password vault or it's something that your administrator knows or administrators know, you need to be careful as far as these passwords, who has them. Actually continuing on here, and I have some recommendations following that, but related to key accounts, I thought in the presentation here it was good to note the differences between act as and impersonation. The ability for an OBIEE administrator to log on behalf of somebody else is a useful feature for debugging, as well as some people, how they've engineered their setup and how they expose OBIEE to their end users, potentially through third-party websites. In the past have used impersonation. Some of I think the more recent functionality, and I'm probably dating myself a little bit here as far as how many versions back that I have familiarity here, but the act as. And there's important differences between impersonation and act as. The security risk here, as you can see, if we kind of read from the bottom up here, that act as is much more straightforward with fewer security risks. The security risk with impersonation start with what is exposed when the URL is formed. If you think about anything that is flowing through a URL, it is also then exposed in Apache logs. What you need to be concerned here would be potentially passwords being exposed in that URL, and the level of access there at the top. You can see that while as act as has the ability to, we'll say, run a report on behalf of somebody else in a read-only mode for a single user. The impersonation allows for full access or full assumption of the identity. Some important notes there if you are not familiar with either of these concepts. Again, the user's guides, of which I've noted a couple of these, and some slides that are coming up would be good to read up on. So, recommendations for these key accounts. You should reconcile certainly who has access to the BI system user and the Oracle system user accounts, as well as what accounts that are being used to support WebLogic. You should think about doing that certainly as part of any reconciliation or full audit of OBIEE. Integrigy is also recommending that you regularly rotate those passwords per specific guidelines. There's some notes here that I'm sharing. Again, we're going to be sending out a copy of this presentation to everyone who's attended and registered here today. There is a specific sequence that you need to go through when you rotate these passwords such that you can successfully bring OBIEE back up. You will need to think about some downtime. You will need to think about, if you don't have a checklist or a process for doing this, for testing that out in a non-production environment. With regard to act as and impersonation, the recommendation here again is if you are not familiar or don't know whether or not you're using this, if you're an IT auditor here today, through a security assessment, this would be something that you would want to investigate and confirm. If you are using it, you need to think through and document a policy for the proper use. Are you allowing impersonation? Do you prefer that people use act as? And we would also, Integrigy, highly recommend implementing, if you are using or considering to use impersonation, but even if you are thinking about act as, to seriously think through your usage tracking and your logging and monitoring policies. We do have a later slide on logging and auditing, but just some key recommendations here as far as the accounts. Number 4, the RPD Security. So for those of you not familiar with what the RPD is, this is the singular file that is created currently on a Windows desktop by developers that has all the queries and metadata that is then, when completed, uploaded into Oracle Enterprise Manager and represents basically the OBIEE application. So it has basically the entire application defined within it. With 11G, Oracle changed how that file is protected. With 11G, the RPD file is completely encrypted for some good reasons. With regard to that password, though, you need to think about who has access to it and whether or not you're using the same password for production as well as non-production. With 11G as well, Oracle gave you the ability to, from that Windows BI admin tool, to save not just as a .rpd file, but also to export that RPD file out as an XML, or basically an XML directory with component XML files for each one of the requisite components inside of the RPD file. If you do that, as the passwords, the connection passwords, for example, if you're using the Oracle eBusiness Suite as a data source, I just want to note for you here today, if you do the export to XML, the connection pool passwords are encrypted, so those are protected. But that said, if you do export to XML, you need to be very careful as to who has access to that information, because it's no longer going to be encrypted. Other recommendations here that we've seen through our assessments have been, again, who has access to the production, let's say RPD. Are you changing the RPD password when it goes from development to test, and again from test to production? Are you regularly rotating the RPD password? Are you using complex passwords? Again, the risk to the application here, it would be almost akin to who has access into the Oracle Data Dictionary. There's a lot of key information in here. If you are storing or reporting on sensitive information within the RPD, you need to think about how you're protecting that. So definitely think about who has access to the RPD password, and make sure at minimum that you have a different password for prod versus non-prod. This slide here, a lot to it, but certainly number 5 here, weak overall OBIEE security. So let's look at the right-hand side first. We have the catalog, we have the repository, and within the repository we have our 3 layers of technology there, the presentation layer, the business model mapping, the physical tables and columns. There is no easy way to reconcile security at all 3, or I should say 4 levels here. Who has access to what as far as the access control list, as far as the catalog, who has access to what as far as the permissions that have been defined to tables and or columns within the presentation layer, who has access to what as far as any row level or column level object filters, either at the BMM or the table level. Through our assessments, we regularly refine what I'll refer to as errors and gaps, or rogue objects, rogue users. We'll say these are surprises. People didn't think that that was in, or certainly assumptions being made that, okay, well, if I do have salary information, what security do I have around that? And many times what we'll find is that the security might only be at the access control list at the catalog level, and the RPD is wide open. Our recommendation here is to think through, if you haven't done so, what is physically defined within the physical tables and columns, and then think about the security around that. Start from the bottom up. What filters do you have in place? Make sure that the information security risks are proportionate, and that you secure it first, we'll say, within the RPD, and then think about the catalog. But as we move on from this slide here, make sure that things are in proportion, that you have the equal security at the top as well as at the bottom. Related here, but number 6 is sensitive data being protected. Again, we're talking really about what is defined at the physical layer within the RPD. Commonly, what we are seeing or have seen is that developers take an RPD file, let's say from one client and or application, and use that as a template. And what could potentially accidentally, or we'll say not so, we'll say intentionally flow in or pop up in the RPD, or maybe information that you are not currently using and or maybe you could use for the future. But the bottom line here is that if it is in the RPD, you need to secure it. Examples of this, that we have on the left there as far as social security numbers, salaries, credit cards. Again, the example of somebody's using OBIEE with the Oracle e-business suite. They've done some metadata imports, and they've tagged large number of columns with an HR, and all of a sudden you have a lot of sensitive HIPAA data present in the RPD file, and potentially little or no security around that other than who can run what report. There's some risk in that, certainly when we start talking about the Go URL in a few slides here, that you will want to be concerned about. So just to recap that, with sensitive data, if it is in the RPD, you need to think about securing it. You need to think about securing it at all levels, all 3 levels that OBIEE gives you. You need to think about the direct SQL access, write back, and Go URL. I'm actually foreshadowing the next few slides here where we'll go through each one of these in more detail. Bottom line recommendation here is that a security assessment, if you are not confident of what sensitive data you might have within your RPD file, certainly within the metadata, you want to establish a baseline and then take that baseline through as far as the security rules at each one of the 3 levels. Direct SQL access. This is standard functionality of OBIEE. It allows you to, primarily built for debugging purposes, to enter a SQL statement. I've chose to talk about 7 and 8 here together because I think write back is, as you can see from the demonstrative example I have here, could be quite, could be a risky proposition. So direct SQL access allows you to, from the business intelligence graphical user interface, enter any DML statement, right? Some key should be only really used for SQL selects, and it should only really be used for debugging purposes. The key point here is that you can only query objects that have been defined within the RPD. So, for example, if I have an OBIEE solution that's going against the Oracle eBusiness Suite, I can't just randomly query any table in the Oracle eBusiness Suite. I can only query those objects that have been defined within the RPD file within the OBIEE metadata. However, this could be, the risk here is that it could be combined with write back. Write back is, again, some standard functionality of OBIEE that allows you to either call an API or issue, let's say, insert or update statements. Calling an API could be used for a few different, there's probably a few different development scenarios that would allow for that. The other scenario that could be used for write back could be, let's say, if you have using OBIEE as a budgeting app and you want to save different scenarios for either sharing with somebody else or the next time you come in. So if you're running a what if at 10% and a what if at 15%. But the risk here that I'm showing you here is that you need to be concerned with who has, one, the ability to run and use direct SQL, and as well as who has the ability to issue writebacks. The security access control list within the catalog is where you determine that. So let's we'll move on to the next slide here, but in a moment here, just to recap what I have here, the SQL statement you see here is it's not something that I've seen in the wild per se, but it's something that's certainly theoretically possible of the Oracle pay proposals table, which is the rate of pay or salary table within the Oracle eBusiness Suite here. And what I'm doing here is giving the user Fred Flintstone a $1 million salary. So another, again, example here of something that we have seen a few times in our security assessment is the F&D user table, specifically Oracle eBusiness Suite passwords, being exposed. So the SQL select that I have here is again, this is something that I've created within my business model mapping. I just have a people and users, which is just a quick join of per all people F against F&D user. And something that we have again seen a few times is people through their metadata imports just tag the F&D user table and bring it in because it's an easy checkbox. Yeah, I want that table, bring it in. But what they're doing is they're pulling in the F&D, the Oracle application password columns. The risk here is that the algorithm to decrypt Oracle eBusiness Suite passwords has been readily available on the internet for quite a few years now. Just as a side comment, if you're running the Oracle eBusiness Suite, you really need to use the one-way hash function, as well as you need to really use the one-way hashing function. There is a difference between encryption and hashing. The encryption is we'll say bidirectional. You want to decrypt the password, encrypt the password, and then decrypt it. The hashing basically is a one-way, and the way it works is that hash is then stored in Oracle. The end user, when they signs on, their secret, their password, or their passphrase is then hashed, and the hashes are then compared. So Oracle, if it's hashed, is never storing the actual password. Even if we were to display the hashed passwords in OBIEE, I wouldn't be able to do anything because it was hashed. So the bottom line here is that you need to be certainly careful of exposing FND user passwords. As well, you could see here that if I had salary information or social security numbers, bank accounts, I would also need to be very concerned about who has access, because what happens here is this direct SQL here, I am throwing SQL straight against the data sources that have been defined. I'm actually bypassing some of the upper layers of OBIEE security. Who has access to direct SQL? You need to be very careful who has access to that. You find that through running the catalog security reports and looking specifically at the security access control list, the security ACL. So I've been talking about write back here and there. Again, connection pools can be set up to allow for write back. You then have to, if that's globally, then you take it for each table as far as whether or not it allows for write back. You need to go through, again, through the security access control list reports to reconcile the appropriate people having the ability to write back. And if they can write back, you want to make sure that that's on the appropriate tables. We'll have a later recommendation on logging and monitoring, but keep that in mind. So the Go URL. OBIEE has multiple user interfaces. There's the graphical user interface that you are most likely all familiar with here. Oracle also has web services, but there is a third user interface that you probably, I'd be surprised if many people are familiar with, and this is called the Go URL. It is a fully functional user interface that allows for sign-on, setting of variables, run reports using just a browser and just assembling URL strings. This user interface, the Go URL, predates certainly Oracle's purchase, and I think it also predates Siebel's purchase of what is now known as the OBIEE technology stack. And there's some serious risks you need to be aware of with regard to the Go URL. And we'll go through a few slides here. But certainly the risk here is the ability to run SQL, to issue SQL. And certainly you need to think about, as you're logging on, running SQL, anything that you're running through the URL that is being captured in the Apache log entries. And as I'm going to demonstrate here in a moment, the Go URL bypasses certainly some layers of OBIEE security that you need to be aware of. If you are public-facing, you need to be especially concerned with how you've engineered OBIEE if you have a public user, and if that public user is, let's say, hard-coded, and that if you're not posting correctly, that URL string could be visible to anybody on Earth who is looking to exploit it. We have, again, we're going to be sending out a copy of this presentation to everyone who is registered. I wanted to include, as the Go URL I have found is not as well documented as it probably could be. I have some specific syntax here that will assist you, or at least give you some direction on how to start looking at it. But I do have a demo queued up here. I'm going to talk through what I'm going to do here. Basically, I'm going to open up a fresh Firefox session, and I'm going to cut, copy, paste this URL string here at the top. And what I'm going to be doing with that is I'm going to be logging in as the user. This is a test user that I've created in our demo environment, Integrigy test 1. And I'm going to be running this SQL statement to show the eBusiness Suite passwords. So I'm going to be running SQL straight from the browser. And more importantly, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be bypassing the presentation layer security. If I had a security rule set as a filter, a row level filter, or a column level filter, lower into the RPD probably at the BML layer or maybe at the physical layer, I wouldn't be able to do this, but this is kind of a case in point that you need to think about making sure that your security at all three levels is aligning and aligning correctly proportionate to the risk of the information you need to protect. And if it is all possible, we recommend that you disable the Go URL. So let's take a moment here. I'm going to bring up Firefox here, and I have a URL string I'm going to be dropping in. And you can see here I just have my server port 9704 is the default port for OBIEE. I have my logon and I have my SQL statement, and at this point in time I'm just clicked return, and what's happening now is that I've logged on and run the SQL, and I've done it straight from a browser here. I have bypassed the presentation layer security. The only thing that is basically there's no protection here. The only protection I could do would be actually two things. One, not import passwords into the metadata. Two, if I've done that, I should have built filters at the BMM layer or at the table column level. So number 10 here, no usage tracking. Oracle provides a sample RPD. There is also a number of reports that, a number of notes that walk through in pretty good detail. I found easy to follow at least how to set up usage tracking within OBIEE. So basically you need to define a connection source to write back to, right? And you then through the standard functionality, you actually have to go into Enterprise Manager and set some attributes to start the logging process. But when those attributes are set and that the information that is generated is very valuable as far as changes to the RPD files and the environment, as well as who ran what report and when with what parameters. So our recommendation is, one, if you're not using usage tracking, to use it. Two, when you are using this, make sure that you are creating a new schema for this. Just don't write into the BI platform or the MDS schema. Again, there's no need to expose that to your developers either for any nefarious purposes or, we'll say, protect against accidents. And last but not least, if when you do start using usage tracking, you want to think about a holistic log and audit solution. You want to think about certainly harvesting that information and pulling that into Splunk or ArcSight or whatever your centralized logging utility or SEM is. This is a bonus slide for those of you who are counting. This is actually number 11. There is a function that is part of the OBIEE, I want to say, syntax or language. It's called evaluate. And if you use this evaluate function, it takes a string that is a SQL statement. The security risk is that any DML, any SQL, be it insert, update, or delete statement that is dropped in there, is blindly executed using the authentication rights of that connections pool. It completely bypasses all levels of OBIEE security. This was a big problem in 10G. With 11G, there's actually a switch that you can globally turn evaluate off or on. And you can find this in the NQ config ini file, and you want to look for the parameter evaluate underscore support underscore level. So evaluate support level, make sure that that's off. Certainly this goes under the umbrella. If somebody can, for whatever reason, they might have turned it on. If you're going through an audit, you want to think about whether or not certainly this is on or off, and check it whenever you do an audit. So we have had a few questions come in. We do have a few. Maybe I should, at this point in time, thank you. But actually, no, before I do that, I do want to note that part 2 of this conversation, the WebLogic Security Top 10, is going to be next Thursday. Here is the link to register for that. I think this link is also going to be up on our website here shortly. But Phil, I'll give it back to you.
Thank you, Mike. We do have a couple of questions that have come in. First one, row-level security. Is it possible to create rules and or filters for?
Very much so. Within the RPD BI, within the tool that you use to create the RPD, within the BI admin tool, you're going to be creating it there. And as I was pointing out, that is really your first level of defense. The demonstration that I gave with the Go URL, had I put in those row-level filters, I wouldn't have been able to do that. So very important to think about the row-level security, certainly if you have sensitive data.
Next question. Who typically administers the security of the OBIEE? Is it typically the role of a DBA, or is there a need for an OBIEE administration role?
There is enough subject matter expertise with each one of the Fusion middleware applications, be it SOA or be it even, I would say, even WebLogic itself, that you need to have a dedicated person who is tasked with keeping current with the latest developments, not just releases of patches, but functionality and how it could be applied. I would strongly recommend that there is an OBIEE administrator, if at all possible. Oracle eBusiness Suite database administrators certainly have a lot on their plate, as certainly if you think about with 12.2 and with WebLogic and the introduction of WebLogic into the tech stack, there's even more being asked of them.
Next one. Any recommendations for E-based filters?
I'll take that as an S-based filter.
Yes, thank you. Sorry.
Yeah. I, off the top of my head, don't have an answer for that. I will need to think about that and get back to whoever answered that or asked that.
Okay. Next one. What are the implications? What are the can't even talk this morning. What are the implementation best practices for OBIEE security?
Well, best practices for implementing security for OBIEE, I would start with actually I would start with the two guides. There's the Oracle Fusion Middleware Security Guide for OBIEE. You can pull that off of the Oracle documentation site. While you're doing that, I would also strongly encourage to pull down another manual, Understanding Security for the Oracle WebLogic Security. There's actually the first one there, the Fusion Middleware Guide for Security for Oracle Business Intelligence, is actually rather well laid out. It has some good chapters, certainly that I would start an auditor reviewing, and then I would certainly task whoever's the business, the OBIEE administrator to master that subject matter.
Okay, next one. How do you change all the OBIEE passwords? That's system counts, keystores, etc.
Good question. The simple answer is very careful. A little bit more of an answer is that, again, you need a checklist for this. There are a number of passwords. You need to change them in the right sequence. And if you don't have that well rehearsed, you need to practice it a few times. There are some specific notes that Oracle has on this. You can find those in MetaLink. I would, though, actually refer back to the Fusion Middleware Security Guide. I think there's one of the appendix, off the top of my head, I think Appendix C actually goes through in pretty good detail the sequence for changing those passwords. Certainly those like the Oracle system user and the BI system user as well.
All right, regarding the Go URL, how do you block it
Not easily. You need to figure out if you're using it. Your developers may have arrived at certain, we'll say, solutions for what they were tasked to provide. Whether or not you are using, or if you're not using it, you need to think about, one, how, if you are public-facing or if you're not. Either way, you block this with a combination of your firewall and or load balancer. Hopefully, if you're not running OBIEE from behind a load balancer, if you're not, it's a little bit more difficult. But the analytics, the SAW DLL, the GoUL is really wrapped up in there, so there's no one easy lever that you can pull to block the Go URL. But if you are running externally, or certainly if you're running with a lot of sensitive information, that's something you probably do need to either give us, if your network team doesn't have some ideas straight out of the box, give us a call. That might be something we could help with.
Another question, I'm not sure how it relates, but is there a tool to extract permissions from catalog objects?
Well, Oracle actually provides one. There is, when you do the install on your laptop, if you're running, let's say, Windows, and the install is creating the VI admin tool, it also installs the client catalog admin tool. This client tool has a reporting feature that allows you to run a report and then export it to Excel. This is actually what we do during our assessments, is that we run that utility to produce these reports, and then we start layering up through a series of Excel pivot tables to give that 360 as far as who can see what, as far as catalog permission grants, and then other reports out of the RPD as far as other security rules.
Next one. For Integrigy's OBIEE security assessments, what is the scope and how long do they take?
Well, another good question. Usually for an OBIEE assessment, we're talking, a week and a half, really depending upon, how much it's being used, if it's public-facing. The assessment will certainly go through OBIEE as far as the authentication providers, the security policies, doing that mapping that I've been talking about as far as the security at all three levels. But we're also looking at the WebLogic implementation, taking a look at the, not just the patch levels of that, but some of what we'll get into next week with regard to the security top 10 for WebLogic, the access into the file system, and how WebLogic scripting tools are used. I guess third, we would also take a look at that metadata database that I was initially referring to very early in today's presentation here, as far as who has access into that, how that is secured, and if someone is interested, be happy to talk further about that.